I did not pack a single cardboard box when the CEO's son fired me. I just smiled, dropped my badge, and walked out. He thought axing my six-figure salary was a genius move. He had no idea his signature on my termination instantly turned the corporation's operations into a federal crime. By the time he finally understood why I did not beg to stay, the FBI was already pouring their morning coffee. Hello to all the wonderful and dedicated listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for always being here with us. We want to be completely transparent and let you know that YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us entirely without the budget to operate, which unfortunately means we are forced to stop uploading new videos here in the near future and will transition our operations over to Patreon. If you find today's story captivating, please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel to listen to exclusive, true stories that are even longer, infinitely more exciting, and packed with highly detailed situations that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors in the same story, which you can access by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the description or the comments section of this video. Now, let us begin today's story, where my name is Natalia Chavez, and I am about to show you exactly how to dismantle a toxic company from the inside out. It was exactly 4:30 on a Friday afternoon in Seattle, and the relentless gray rain was pounding against the pristine, floor-to-ceiling glass windows of Viridian Flux Dynamics. I, Natalia Chavez, a 38-year-old woman who had spent the better part of a decade meticulously building the compliance framework that kept this massive tech and energy company out of federal prison, was summoned to the executive suite. Sitting across from me was a boy who had barely outgrown his college fraternity phase. His name was Julian Vance. At 26 years old, Julian had achieved absolutely nothing of substance in his entire life, save for the biological luck of being the son of the chief executive officer. With his father on an indefinite medical leave, Julian had impulsively decided to play king of the castle. He sat completely slouched in his ergonomic chair, wearing an absurdly expensive tech vest, and taking obnoxiously loud sips of artisan kombucha. He did not look at me with the respect of a seasoned colleague, or even the basic decency one human being owes another. He looked at me as if I were merely an inconvenient line item on a sprawling spreadsheet that he desperately wanted to erase. Natalia, we are shifting our corporate paradigm, Julian began, his voice dripping with that unearned, obnoxious confidence only wealthy heirs possess. As acting director, I am spearheading a massive lean restructuring initiative. We need some serious human resource optimization to maximize our quarterly runway and trim the fat. I was mindlessly stringing together hollow buzzwords. He had likely skimmed from a trendy business blog that very morning, but I knew exactly what was truly happening behind the scenes. Julian had not even bothered to read my employee's personnel file. If he had taken 5 minutes to look, he would have known that my title, Chief Environmental Compliance Architect, was not just some empty corporate label designed to inflate my ego. I held the sole federal patents and the highly restricted personal government certifications that legally allowed Viridian Flux Dynamics to operate our highly volatile chemical processing plants. My personal biometrics and unique digital signatures were integrated directly into the Federal Environmental Protection Agency databases, without my active credentials securing the grid. Our facilities legally could not push a single drop of hazardous waste through their industrial systems. But Julian did not care about environmental compliance, federal law, or industrial safety. He only saw my substantial six-figure salary and the operating costs of my department through the reliable corporate grapevine. I already knew exactly where my hard-earned salary was destined to go. Julian was secretly funneling various department budgets into a massive, unregulated offshore cryptocurrency mining project. He genuinely thought he was a financial visionary, cutting out a seemingly redundant middle management position to quietly fund his delusional digital gold rush without the board of directors ever finding out. So, we are letting you go. Effective immediately, Julian concluded, waving his hand dismissively toward the door as if he were swatting away a bothersome insect. Security will escort you out in exactly 15 minutes. I highly suggest you start packing your desk right now." He leaned back, intertwining his fingers, waiting for the tears to fall. He waited for me to panic, to beg for my livelihood, to try and negotiate my severance, or to desperately remind him of my years of unwavering loyalty to his ailing father. He thrived on that twisted, unbalanced power dynamic, desperate to prove he was a ruthless businessman. Instead of getting angry or throwing a tantrum, I offered him a calm, almost terrifyingly peaceful smile. I did not raise my voice by a single decibel. I did not argue or attempt to justify my worth. The sheer, unbothered tranquility of my reactions seemed to unsettle him for a brief fraction of a second, but his colossal, fragile ego quickly smoothed over any momentary doubt. "I understand completely, Julian," I said, keeping my voice smooth, leveled, and perfectly polite. Business is business, after all. However, since my specific role involves interfacing directly with federal regulators, I have prepared a standard offboarding document to ensure a seamless transition of power for you. I reached into my sleek leather portfolio and slid a single sheet of heavy stock paper across his pristine mahogany desk. It was titled The Liability Release and Handover Protocol. To an untrained eye, or a lazy son desperate to get back to his investments, it looked like standard, boring corporate bureaucracy. In reality, it was a lethal legal instrument. The fine print explicitly stated that upon signing, the company formally acknowledged the immediate revocation of my personal environmental certifications from their operational systems, and that I was completely indemnified and legally severed from any operational failures, compliance breaches, or catastrophic shutdowns that occurred the exact second I walked out the door. Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes and barely glancing at the bold header at the top of the page. He hastily grabbed his expensive fountain pen and furiously scribbled his signature at the bottom of the document, utterly desperate to get back to his kombucha and his fluctuating crypto charts. "Leave your keycard on the desk and get out," he ordered, not even bothering to look up at me. I picked up my copy of the freshly signed contract, folded it neatly, and tucked it safely into my pocket. I stood up, placing my plastic corporate keycard precisely in the center of his desk. I did not bother packing a cardboard box full of memories. All my essential personal files were already secured. I simply reached over and grabbed my favorite ceramic coffee mug from the side table. "Good luck with your human resource optimization, Julian," I said softly, my voice laced with a subtle venom he was too blind to detect. I turned my back and walked out of the sterile glass office. As the heavy elevator doors closed, shielding me from the polished corporate floor for the very last time, I took a deep, refreshing breath of pure satisfaction. Julian Vance thought he had just saved the company a few $100,000 with a stroke of his pen. He had absolutely no idea that his sloppy, arrogant signature had just triggered an irreversible operational countdown that would bring a multi-billion-dollar empire crashing down onto his head. The fuse was officially lit, and I was going to thoroughly enjoy watching the magnificent fireworks. By 8 o'clock on Monday morning, my apartment was filled with the rich, earthy aroma of freshly ground Ethiopian dark roast. I stood in my kitchen, wearing my most comfortable silk robe, slowly and methodically pouring boiling water in precise, concentric circles over the coffee grounds. It was a ritual of pure patience, a stark contrast to the frantic, flashing chaos illuminating my kitchen island. My personal cell phone, still tethered to the emergency automated notification system of Viridian Flux Dynamics, was vibrating with a relentless, rhythmic intensity. The screen was an endless cascade of urgent red banners and critical failure alerts. I did not rush to silence it. I simply watched the notifications pile up as I savored my first, perfect sip of morning coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The internal architecture of the compliance software was something I had meticulously designed from the ground up over a span of 6 years. It was not a basic program that relied on simple passwords that could be easily reset by an overzealous help desk technician. It was an ironclad fortress, hardwired to my personal biometric data and my highly restricted federal certification token. At exactly midnight on Sunday, 48 hours after my termination was formally processed by the Human Resources Department, The system recognized that my legal employee status had been completely revoked, acting perfectly according to its rigid programming. The software initiated an automatic, total lockdown across the entire corporate network to prevent any unauthorized environmental actions. The immediate, real-world consequences were absolutely staggering. I could see the cascading operational failures unfolding right there on my screen. Hundreds of miles away, the massive industrial gates at our primary chemical processing plants in Portland and Spokane were frozen completely shut. Convoys of heavy transport trucks carrying highly volatile chemical compounds and thousands of gallons of toxic hazardous waste materials were lined up on the interstate highways, completely stranded and blocking traffic. Without my authenticated, federal-level digital signature verifying the daily environmental safety thresholds, the system legally could not, and would not, authorize a single shipment to move in or out of the loading docks. The red alerts aggressively flashing across my phone were essentially automated screams from the regional facility managers. They were waking up to the horrifying realization that their entire supply chain had just slammed face first into a reinforced concrete wall, and they were hemorrhaging millions of dollars by the hour. I could practically visualize the utter, suffocating panic taking hold in the glass-walled executive suite back in Seattle. I knew Julian Vance intimately well. I knew the fragile, bloated architecture of his inflated ego. Instead of doing the one rational thing that could have temporarily saved him, which would be picking up the phone, admitting his colossal mistake, and begging me to come back to unlock the grid, he chose the path of ultimate, blinding arrogance. Through the public-facing Federal Environmental Regulatory Portal, an external database which I still had legal access to as a registered, independent citizen, I could monitor the digital footprints echoing out from the company servers in real time. I watched the audit logs pinging wildly as Julian desperately summoned a junior IT employee named Trevor to his office. I had worked with Trevor many times before. He was 23 years old, brilliant with network architecture, but generally terrified of executive authority. I could read the server requests like a tragic, unfolding play. Julian was aggressively demanding that Trevor physically bypass the security protocols, hack the compliance lockdown, and force the factory gates open. I watched the portal log show 3 separate administrative override attempts fail miserably. Then, the frantic digital attempts suddenly stopped. I knew exactly what that heavy pause meant. Trevor, despite his youth and his fear of losing his job, clearly understood the catastrophic legal implications of tampering with a federally mandated safety firewall. He had refused the direct order. He had looked the acting chief executive officer in the eye and told him no, because doing so meant risking a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Furious, deeply humiliated, and backed into a dangerous corner entirely of his own making, Julian made the most fatal error of his short, pathetic career. If the IT department would not break federal law for him, he decided he would just do it himself. The public portal suddenly refreshed on my laptop screen, and a new, chilling notification appeared. Someone had just initiated a manual, executive override of the environmental safety logs. Julian was using his supreme administrative network privileges to bypass the automated environmental sensors entirely, because the sensors were locked by my absence. He was manually inputting fake environmental data to trick the federal servers. He was typing in fabricated chemical toxicity levels, inventing fictitious waste disposal metrics, and forging the daily safety reports just to force the system to print the shipping manifests and get the trucks moving again. He genuinely believed that because his family name was on the building, he owned the absolute truth. He thought he was just pushing some annoying digital paperwork to save his precious quarterly profit margins and protect his secret cryptocurrency project. In reality, he was meticulously typing out his own federal indictment. Every single keystroke he made was a heavily documented act of felony fraud against the United States government. I sat down at my dining table, placing my coffee mug next to my laptop. The bright morning sun was streaming through the large windows, casting a warm, peaceful glow over my workspace. I opened my secure, encrypted archiving software and began to methodically capture everything. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single forged manual entry he submitted. I downloaded the raw data packets, showing Julian's specific executive login credentials permanently attached to the falsified toxicity reports. I carefully cross-referenced his fake, perfectly safe numbers with the actual, failing telemetry data being broadcasted by the locked-out Portland and Spokane facilities. I did not feel a single shred of pity for him. I just kept clicking, saving, and backing up the digital evidence to an external, offline hard drive hidden in my desk drawer. With every file I successfully saved, the invisible snare around Julian Vance pulled a fraction of an inch tighter. The trap had not just sprung, it had completely shattered his legs, and the arrogant, foolish boy had not even felt the cold steel teeth sink into his flesh yet. I calmly closed my laptop, walked over to the kitchen sink, and washed my mug, completely at peace knowing that the impending storm was now mathematically unstoppable. By the time the sun rose on Wednesday, the temporary, desperate, Band-Aids Julian had slapped onto the system had completely disintegrated. The manual overrides he forced through the network on Monday had only delayed the inevitable. They provided a brief illusion of control, allowing a few trucks to move, but they absolutely could not trick the deep-level federal audit algorithms that swept the mainframes every 48 hours. Now, the supply chain was not just stalled, it was aggressively bleeding millions of dollars a day. Highly volatile chemical compounds were sitting in unmoving freight trains, slowly approaching their critical expiration temperatures. Massive cargo ships were anchored off the coast, racking up exorbitant daily holding fees because our facilities could not legally receive their raw materials. Julian finally slammed into the brutal wall of reality. He realized that the core compliance engine was fundamentally and inextricably tethered to my personal patents. There was no digital backdoor. There was no clever technical workaround. The system was completely paralyzed without my living, breathing authorization. My personal cell phone quickly became a fascinating psychological case study of a narcissist losing his grip on reality. He called me 19 times between Tuesday night and Wednesday afternoon. I listened to his voicemails while watering my houseplants, fascinated by his rapid descent. The first few messages were dripping with his usual blind condescension. "Natalia, it is Julian. We are experiencing a minor technical glitch with the legacy software you left behind. Call my executive assistant immediately to walk her through the reset protocol. Do not make me ask twice." By Wednesday morning, the tone had shifted into frantic anger. "You are deliberately sabotaging company property. You are legally obligated to answer my phone calls. Pick up the damn phone." By Wednesday afternoon, he abandoned all pretense of corporate professionalism and resorted to unhinged, desperate threats. "I will personally make sure you never work in this industry again. You are violating federal law by holding our environmental systems hostage. I am giving you exactly 1 hour to get down here and fix this, or I am calling the police." The psychological projection was almost poetic. He was threatening me with federal law, while he was actively violating it. The board of directors was starting to ask pointed questions about the sudden, catastrophic drop in regional output. Julian was terrified of his sick father finding out that he had broken the golden goose in less than a week, to hide his colossal mistake. Julian executed a move so breathtakingly stupid, it felt genuinely surreal to witness from afar. He fabricated a retroactive intellectual property handover agreement, using his supreme executive network privileges. He dug into the old human resources archives, extracted a cached digital copy of my electronic signature, and pasted it onto the forged document. He essentially backdated a fake contract to the day before he fired me, legally binding my private, federally recognized patents to Viridian flux dynamics without my knowledge or consent. With that fake document secretly uploaded to the internal compliance servers, Julian breathed a massive sigh of relief. He actually believed he had outsmarted the system and covered his tracks perfectly. Feeling invincible once again, he immediately went back to his primary obsession. He resumed siphoning the massive operational budget from my former environmental department, routing the company funds straight into his hidden, offshore cryptocurrency accounts. He was looting a burning building, utterly convinced that no one could see the towering plumes of black smoke. While he was busy committing corporate suicide in his sterile glass penthouse, I was sitting in a worn, cracked vinyl booth at a remarkably unimpressive diner just outside the city limits. The air inside smelled heavily of cheap frying oil, stale black coffee, and rain. Sitting directly across from me was Elias Thorne. Elias was a legal apex predator. He was the most feared whistleblower attorney on the West Coast, an older man in a sharp wool suit who had personally dismantled major pharmaceutical giants and corrupt defense contractors. He did not take cases for the money. He took them to hunt. I pushed a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope across the sticky diner table. "It is all right there, Elias," I said softly, watching him slide the documents out. The forged safety logs. From Monday. The fabricated retroactive intellectual property contract from this morning, and the complete financial routing numbers proving he is actively embezzling corporate funds into unregulated offshore digital wallets. Elias put on his reading glasses, skimming the highly classified, perfectly organized documents with cold, calculating eyes. He studied the fake signature, cross-referencing the digital timestamps I had provided. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, and he let out a low, impressed whistle. "This boy is exceptionally foolish," Elias murmured, tapping his finger against the forged contract. "He has practically gift-wrapped a federal indictment for us. But you must understand, Natalia, taking down the son will inevitably alert the father. Once we file this, the explosion will not be contained to Julian. The federal agencies will tear through the entire executive floor. Are you entirely prepared for the massive magnitude of this fallout?" I looked out the diner window, watching the relentless rain wash over the dark pavement. My ultimate goal was never just to punish Julian for being a spoiled, arrogant brat. He was merely the weakest, loudest link in a chain of systemic, top-down corruption that had been quietly poisoning this company for years. The board of directors and his father knew all about the unsafe chemical processing limits long before Julian took over, and they had consistently looked the other way to protect their lucrative stock dividends. I wanted to burn the whole rotting structure to the ground. "Elias," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and utterly resolute. "I do not just want to break his shiny new throne. I want to shatter the entire kingdom. Let them all drown in the wreckage." On Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters shifted from strained anxiety to pure, unadulterated horror. The trigger was a massive fleet of black, government-issued sport utility vehicles pulling up completely unannounced at the main gates of the Portland Chemical Processing Facility. I had made a brief, anonymous phone call from an untraceable public terminal late Wednesday night, providing precisely enough technical data to guarantee an immediate emergency response. By 9 o'clock in the morning, over 24 heavily armed federal agents from the Environmental Protection Agency, wearing their signature navy blue windbreakers, had aggressively swarmed the factory floor. They immediately seized the local network server racks, locked down the hazardous loading bays, and began pulling regional managers into windowless rooms for aggressive interrogations under the immediate threat of federal obstruction charges. The terrifying news hit the executive floor in Seattle like a localized seismic shockwave. Through my remaining, highly secured network taps, I could practically feel the temperature instantly drop inside the executive boardroom. Julian Vance was completely losing his mind. His pristine, arrogant facade finally cracked wide open, revealing the terrified, sweating boy underneath the expensive tailoring. The blatantly forged environmental safety logs he had manually submitted earlier in the week were now being pulled apart by federal forensic auditors in real time. He knew with absolute certainty that if the board of directors found out about the illegal system overrides, he would be instantly crucified and thrown to the federal prosecutors without a second thought. Pure desperation breeds severe stupidity. Realizing that his neck was firmly resting on the chopping block, Julian sent his highest-ranking corporate attack dog directly to my personal residence. Just after lunchtime, a sharp, hurried knock echoed through my apartment. I slowly opened the door to find Richard, the senior director of human resources. Richard was a man who usually navigated the corporate hallways with the slick, oily confidence of a highly paid assassin. But today, his pale skin was glistening with a heavy, sickening layer of nervous sweat. His silk tie was slightly crooked, and he was clutching a heavy black leather briefcase so tightly against his chest that his knuckles were stark white. "Natalia, please, you have to let me come in," Richard pleaded, his voice violently shaking with a desperate urgency he could not completely hide. "We can speak right here in the hallway." "Richard," I replied smoothly, leaning casually against the doorframe, offering him nothing but a polite, unyielding gaze. He swallowed hard, glancing nervously up and down the quiet apartment corridor before aggressively pushing the heavy briefcase toward me. "Julian is prepared to be incredibly generous about this entire situation. We have experienced a highly sensitive, localized system error, a minor technical glitch in the legacy code you built. Julian is offering you a highly lucrative consulting fee. There is a massive signing bonus right here in cash, and a brand new employment contract at exactly 3 times your previous salary. All you have to do is sign this airtight non-disclosure agreement, come back to the office for 1 single hour, and clear the system blockage." It was a classic, pathetic corporate bribe, a desperate, heavy-handed attempt to stuff a terrifying monster back into the closet with a handful of $100 bills. "A minor technical glitch," I repeated slowly, letting the sheer, insulting absurdity of his words hang heavily in the tense air between us. "Richard, you and I both know perfectly well there is absolutely no glitch. You are standing on my doorstep holding a briefcase full of desperate hush money because federal agents are currently tearing apart your primary supply chain. Julian broke federal law, and he furiously wants me to come back and be his human shield." Richard looked completely defeated. He opened his mouth to argue, to deploy some carefully rehearsed psychological manipulation tactic he had used 100 times before on lesser employees. But the words died silently in his throat. I reached over and gently, but firmly, pushed the heavy leather briefcase back toward his chest. "I politely declined the generous offer, Richard. However, since you made the long drive out here in the rain, I do have a highly sensitive document that desperately needs to be delivered to the office," I said, keeping my tone exceptionally pleasant and perfectly measured. I reached back onto the small wooden entryway table and picked up a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. Across the front, written in bold, thick black marker, were the words, "Federal subpoena evidence, for the eyes of Victoria Sterling only." Victoria Sterling was the notoriously ruthless chairwoman of the board of directors. She was a deeply intimidating woman who navigated the brutal waters of corporate warfare with the cold, unfeeling precision of a great white shark. She openly despised Julian, barely tolerating his daily existence at the company solely out of residual respect for his ailing father. "Hand this envelope directly to Victoria," I instructed softly, pressing the heavy package into Richard's trembling hands. "If you give it to Julian, or if you even attempt to destroy it, my attorney will have a digital copy sent to the federal prosecutor's office by the end of the day, with your specific name permanently attached as a willing co-conspirator to corporate fraud. Do you understand me clearly?" Richard stared down at the bold black lettering on the envelope, as if it were an active, ticking grenade. He nodded frantically, completely unable to speak, and stumbled backward toward the elevator doors. Sitting alone in his idling luxury car in my parking lot, 15 minutes later, the crushing, suffocating weight of extreme paranoia finally overtook Richard's sworn loyalty to the acting chief executive. With trembling fingers, he carefully peeled back the corner of the envelope seal, just enough to catch a terrifying glimpse of the contents. He saw the high-resolution screenshots of Julian's manually forged federal entries. He saw the illegally backdated intellectual property contracts. He saw the massive offshore financial routing numbers. The sheer, apocalyptic magnitude of the documented felonies made his stomach violently churn. Richard instantly realized that Julian was a walking corpse, and standing anywhere near him when the federal bomb finally detonated meant spending the next 20 years rotting in a maximum security penitentiary. Richard did not return to Julian's lavish penthouse office. He walked straight past the frantic executive suite, entirely ignoring the dozen desperate text messages blowing up his phone. and marched directly into the heavily guarded upper boardroom to hand the explosive package straight into the waiting hands of Victoria Sterling. By late Thursday afternoon, the entire corporate headquarters had completely descended into a silent, suffocating atmosphere of intense, creeping paranoia. The executive assistants abruptly stopped answering their ringing phones. The legal department suddenly locked their heavy glass doors from the inside. Nobody spoke a word in the hallways, but every single employee could physically feel the heavy executioner's blade slowly being cranked high into the air. Up in his sprawling glass penthouse, completely isolated and utterly blind to the massive, fatal betrayal that had just occurred right beneath his feet, Julian finally decided it was time to cut his enormous losses and run. He opened his private laptop, frantically preparing to transfer the remaining millions of embezzled department funds into an untraceable, decentralized digital wallet before skipping the country. He typed in his complex, highly secure administrative password and smashed the enter key with a sweating palm. Instead of the familiar, comforting green confirmation screen, a harsh, flashing red banner aggressively seized his monitor. Access denied. Financial privileges revoked pending internal board investigation. Julian stared blankly at the glowing screen. A cold, sickening wave of pure, paralyzing terror violently washing over his entire body. The heavy steel walls of his invisible prison had just violently snapped shut. Victoria Sterling had quietly seized the financial reins, and the apex predator of Viridian flux dynamics was finally circling the bloody water, locking her dead eyes onto the foolish boy who had so carelessly ruined her empire. It was precisely 8 o'clock on Friday morning when the heavy, reinforced mahogany doors of the primary executive boardroom quietly clicked shut, sealing the room like a pressurized vault. Julian Vance strode through the threshold, wearing a freshly pressed, impeccably tailored Italian suit, completely blind to the execution squad waiting for him. He carried a sleek tablet under his arm and wore a forced, sickeningly confident smile tightly plastered across his face, in his breathtakingly narrow mind. He genuinely believed he had been summoned to present an emergency quarterly financial defense. He thought he was walking in to charm the board of directors with empty promises of future cryptocurrency yields and temporary supply chain restructuring. Instead, the moment his expensive leather shoes touched the thick boardroom carpet, his arrogant smile instantly dissolved into a mask of unadulterated shock. The sprawling, polished oak table was not occupied by the usual assortment of compliant, nodding executives. Sitting directly at the head of the table was Victoria Sterling, her posture rigidly straight, her eyes radiating a cold, lethal intensity that could freeze boiling water. Flanking her on both sides was the entire corporate legal defense team, a row of severe-looking men and women in dark suits, staring at Julian as if he were a highly contagious disease. But the sight that completely drained the blood from Julian's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost, was the man sitting heavily in the corner chair. It was his father, Marcus Vance. Marcus was supposed to be strictly confined to a hospital bed on the other side of the country, resting under strict doctor orders following a severe cardiac event. Yet, here he was, breathing shallowly, his face a terrifying shade of pale, ashen gray. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his rage seemed to be the only thing keeping him upright. He did not say a single word to his son. He simply stared at Julian with a look of absolute, soul-crushing disgust, a silent condemnation that hit harder than a physical blow. Take a seat, Julian, Victoria commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tense, suffocating silence of the room like a razor blade. Julian practically collapsed into the nearest leather chair, his hands trembling so violently he had to hide them beneath the heavy wooden table. Before he could even open his mouth to stutter a greeting, Victoria pressed a single button on her console. The massive high-definition projector screen dominating the far wall hummed to life, plunging the room into a stark, glaring white light. Every single piece of the meticulously organized dossier I had handed to Elias Thorne, less than 48 hours prior, was now brilliantly illuminated for the entire room to see. Victoria did not shout. She did not express outrage. She simply narrated his destruction with the clinical, unfeeling precision of a forensic pathologist dissecting a corpse. She methodically clicked through the slides, exposing every single layer of his pathetic, amateurish conspiracy. First, she displayed the raw server logs, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Julian had used his supreme administrative privileges to manually input fabricated safety metrics, deliberately tricking the federal environmental censors. Next, the screen shifted to the deeply incriminating retroactive intellectual property contract, highlighting the blatantly forged digital signature he had desperately pasted onto the document. Finally, the display transitioned to a complex web of financial routing numbers, clearly tracing the massive, unauthorized hemorrhaging of corporate department budgets directly into his highly volatile, offshore cryptocurrency wallets. You have single-handedly orchestrated the most catastrophic string of federal felonies this corporation has ever seen in its 40-year history, Victoria stated, her eyes locked onto his sweating face. You have completely paralyzed our core infrastructure, stolen highly classified intellectual property, and engaged in massive corporate embezzlement. The federal agents currently dismantling our regional facilities are just the beginning. Panic, raw and unfiltered, violently seized Julian's brain, his survival instincts, warped by a lifetime of extreme privilege and avoiding consequences, frantically kicked in. He leaped out of his chair, his voice cracking loudly as he pointed a shaking finger at the glaring projection screen. "This is a setup!" Julian screamed, his breathing ragged and uneven. "This is a highly sophisticated, malicious cyber attack. It is Natalia. She is a completely unhinged, disgruntled employee. I fired her on Friday to optimize our payroll, and she hacked our internal mainframes out of pure revenge. She fabricated these server logs to frame me. She is holding our environmental grid hostage to extort this company, and you are all blindly falling for it." It was a desperate, chaotic lie, spun from thin air in a frantic attempt to shift the blame. For a brief, terrifying second, a heavy silence fell over the room. Julian looked around, desperately hoping his fabricated narrative of the vengeful hacker had planted a seed of doubt. Then, the chief legal counsel, a formidable woman named Sarah, slowly stood up. She did not look angry. She looked profoundly exhausted by his stupidity. That defense might have actually worked. "Julian, if Natalia was as reckless and foolish as you are," Sarah said, tapping her finger against the polished wood of the table, "but she is significantly smarter than you. She anticipated every single lie you were going to tell in this exact room." Sarah pressed a button on her own remote, and the screen flashed to a new document. It was the liability release and handover protocol, the exact piece of paper Julian had hastily signed on Friday afternoon without reading a single word of the fine print. "When Natalia placed this document on your desk, it was not just a piece of paper," Sarah explained, her voice echoing with total finality. The digital counterpart to this release, heavily integrated into the compliance software, was hard-coded with an irrefutable, decentralized blockchain timestamp, the exact millisecond your expensive fountain pen touched the paper. A unique cryptographic hash was permanently minted onto a public ledger. It established a concrete, unalterable digital timeline. Julian's eyes widened in sheer horror as the complex technical trap finally began to make sense to him. "That immutable blockchain timestamp," Sarah continued relentlessly, "proves absolutely that you legally terminated her system access and assumed full personal administrative control over the environmental grid on Friday at precisely 4:45 in the afternoon. However, the manual, illegal overrides of the safety sensors, the gross falsification of the chemical toxicity reports, and the fraudulent retroactive contract creation did not occur until Monday morning and Wednesday afternoon." Sarah leaned forward, delivering the killing blow. "Natalia did not hack anything. The blockchain proves she was entirely locked out of the network for 3 full days before those federal crimes were committed. You were the only human being on Earth with the administrative keys to force those actions. You built your own cage, locked the door from the inside, and handed her the only key." Julian physically slumped in his chair. all the air rushing out of his lungs. The fragile, pathetic illusion of his superiority completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He looked toward his father for any sign of salvation, any glimmer of paternal protection. But Marcus Vance slowly turned his face away, refusing to even look at the monumental failure carrying his last name. "The United States Department of Justice is not interested in negotiating with us," Sarah announced coldly, closing her leather binder, "because of your direct documented actions. Viridian Flux Dynamics is currently facing an immediate federal fine of exactly $50 million for blatant environmental compliance violations. As for you personally, Julian, the corporate legal umbrella has been completely revoked. The company will not protect you. You are facing multiple federal charges for wire fraud, forgery of government records, and massive embezzlement. You are going to federal prison, and there is absolutely nothing your father or anyone else in this room can do to stop it." At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy silence in Elias Thorne's downtown office was broken by the sharp chime of an incoming secure video call. I sat deeply settled into a plush leather armchair, resting my hands neatly in my lap. Elias stood behind me, looking like a proud architect admiring his finished bridge. When the large monitor on the wall flickered to life, I was instantly transported straight into the suffocating atmosphere of the Viridian Flux Dynamics boardroom. The sheer devastation on the other side of the screen was beautiful. The mighty Victoria Sterling, usually a terrifying force of nature, looked exhausted and deeply cornered. Marcus Vance, clutching his chest, looked 10 years older than he had just a week prior. And sitting at the far end of the long oak table was Julian. He was completely broken, staring at the polished wood with hollow, terrified eyes, his expensive suit now looking like a cheap costume. "Natalia," Marcus croaked, his voice thick with a desperate, unfamiliar humility, "we have reviewed the undeniable facts. We recognize the catastrophic error in judgment made by my son. I am personally asking you, begging you, to come back. We are prepared to offer you the title of Senior Compliance Director, a massive signing bonus, and a highly substantial equity stake in the corporation. Julian is officially terminated as of this exact minute. Just please, log in and stop the bleeding." Julian flinched as his father fired him on live video, a pathetic whimper escaping his throat, but he did not dare look up at the screen. I let his desperate plea hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. I looked at the three of them, the so-called titans of industry, practically crawling on their knees. "I appreciate the incredibly generous offer, Marcus," I replied, my voice smooth, calm, and completely devoid of any sympathy. "But I must politely decline. You see, I no longer have the legal bandwidth to assist Viridian Flux Dynamics. Early this morning, I finalized a massive, exclusive contract. I sold the fully upgraded, legally impenetrable next-generation version of my compliance architecture to EcoApex Solutions." The collective gasp in the boardroom was audible. EcoApex Solutions was their fiercest, most aggressive market rival. By handing them my system, I had just crowned them the undisputed kings of the energy sector, leaving Viridian to suffocate in the regulatory dust. "Furthermore," I continued, leaning slightly closer to the camera lens, "I did not just hand these documents over to your internal board. My attorney, Elias Thorne, officially filed my extensive dossier with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Environmental Protection Agency yesterday afternoon. I am now officially classified as a federally protected government whistleblower." Victoria closed her eyes, knowing exactly what that meant. "That status guarantees me absolute, ironclad legal immunity," I explained cheerfully. "It also entitles me to a massive government bounty. When the federal prosecutors collect that $50 million penalty you owe them, the whistleblower laws dictate that I receive a very healthy percentage of those collected funds. Julian's absolute incompetence did not just fund my early retirement, it practically bought me a private island." The reality of his utter destruction finally crashed down on Julian all at once. The arrogant heir who had smugly fired me just 7 days ago completely shattered. He buried his face in his trembling hands, openly and loudly sobbing. He cried for his lost trust fund, his ruined reputation, and the terrifying, unavoidable reality of a federal prison cell. Right at that moment, the heavy boardroom doors violently burst open. A breathless corporate security guard stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with panic. He did not even wait to be acknowledged before shouting that 24 armed federal agents had just breached the ground floor lobby and were currently locking down the elevators. Julian wailed loudly, a truly pathetic, guttural sound of pure defeat. I did not offer a single word of parting advice. I did not say goodbye, nor did I gloat. I simply reached out and severed the secure connection. The large monitor in the law office instantly went black. I picked up my ceramic mug, took a long, satisfying sip of my warm coffee, and smiled. I had just burned a corrupt, multi-billion-dollar empire entirely to the ground, and I had not even dirtied a single fingernail doing it. Thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are all listening from, so please let me know in the comments. As we mentioned earlier, if you found today's story captivating and satisfying, we desperately need your help because the channel is now demonetized. We absolutely will not be able to upload any new videos here in the near future and will be shifting all of our operations over to Patreon. Please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel to listen to the absolute best, most exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen, or by clicking the link provided in the description or the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and stay strong out there.